When most people think of medieval weapons, they imagine shining swords, noble duels, and knights in armor. But the reality of war in the Middle Ages was far more brutal, and the axe was at the center of it. This weapon wasn't just a tool for chopping wood, it was specifically built to crush armor, break shields, and end fights quickly. In this video, we'll take a closer look at why medieval axes were often deadlier than swords. On the battlefield, in the hands of peasants, and even in the courts of kings. Number 1. Weight, impact, and brutality. In the brutal and unforgiving world of medieval warfare, nothing spoke louder than sheer, unfiltered power. Among the many weapons that spilled blood on the battlefield, the axe stood out for one simple reason. It didn't just kill, it obliterated. Unlike the sword, which was often a symbol of nobility and demanded years of training to wield effectively, the medieval axe thrived on raw physics. It was a weapon of force, not finesse, and that made it deadly in ways swords simply couldn't match. What made the axe particularly lethal was where the weight was focused. With swords, the blade was balanced across its length, which gave it agility and control, ideal for duels or quick slashes. Axes, on the other hand, placed the majority of their mass right at the head, often made of dense iron or steel. That design didn't just increase the cutting potential, it generated incredible momentum with every swing. Picture a heavy blade on a long wooden shaft, arcing through the air and landing with bone-shattering force. This wasn't a weapon that danced around an enemy's guard, it smashed right through it. And here's the thing that made axes terrifying on the battlefield. They didn't care who you were or what you wore. While swords had to seek out weak points in armor, joints, gaps, exposed necks, axes simply didn't need to be that precise. A heavy axe could hit square on a knight's breastplate and still cause massive trauma underneath. The blade might not penetrate the metal entirely, but it didn't have to. The shockwave alone could break ribs, rupture organs, or knock the wind out of someone so violently they'd hit the ground, gasping. And once you were on the ground in a medieval fight, you were as good as dead. Even chainmail, which was designed to stop slashes and protect vital areas, couldn't stop an axe from doing damage. The mail might stay intact, but the body beneath it could still be crushed. That kind of internal injury wasn't easy to treat. If it didn't kill you outright, infection or internal bleeding likely would. Swords aimed to cut. Axes aimed to end. Now, think about how this played out during chaotic battles, where formations broke down and soldiers were fighting in tight quarters, often shoulder to shoulder. In that kind of environment, the axe was ideal. Its weight gave it momentum, and its design meant you didn't need to be graceful, just violent and fast. Even if your swing wasn't perfect, it still hurt. You didn't have to carve clean lines into your enemy. One blow to the side of the head, one crash into the ribs, and the fight was over. And it didn't matter if the blade was dull. That's what's often misunderstood. A sword had to stay sharp. A dull sword was practically useless. But a blunt axe? It could still break bones, split skulls, and ruin a shield. Its effectiveness wasn't tied to perfect maintenance. It was built to withstand abuse, to keep killing even when chipped and dirty, even when soaked in blood or caked in mud. That reliability, paired with the sheer damage it could do, made the axe more than just a weapon. It was a force of nature on the medieval battlefield. Number 2. Better versus evolving armor. As medieval warfare developed, so did the technology meant to survive it. What began as simple chainmail eventually transformed into full suits of articulated plate armor, sophisticated, layered, and often custom-fitted to the bodies of elite warriors. For the average weapon, that evolution posed a serious problem. Swords, for example, found themselves losing effectiveness as armor, became less about deflecting and more about outright stopping a blade. A traditional slashing attack, which might have devastated an unprotected or lightly armored opponent, now simply skidded off a well-made breastplate. Even thrusting techniques, while still dangerous, demanded extreme precision. You had to land a stab in exactly the right place, in the armpit, behind the knee, or through a visor slit. Not only was that hard in training, but near impossible in the middle of a chaotic, blood-soaked melee. Axes didn't have that problem. They didn't need to aim for perfection because they were never about finesse in the first place. The axe wasn't just a weapon, it was a response to evolving armor. When the knight became a walking fortress, the battlefield needed something that could knock the walls down, and that's exactly what the axe did. A heavy-headed axe, especially when swung from overhead or the side, delivered brutal impact in a compact space. The power wasn't spread out like with the sword's edge, it was concentrated into a smaller contact zone, and that made all the difference. Even if the blade didn't slice into the armor itself, the kinetic energy behind the blow could crumple metal, break ribs, or stagger the opponent long enough to deliver a finishing strike. Pole axes in particular were designed to address these challenges head-on. These weren't just longer axes, they were complex instruments of destruction made for elite combatants. On one side, you had a broad axe blade, perfect for crushing blows. On the other, a hammer or spike, capable of penetrating armor through sheer force. And often at the top, there was a spear-like point to thrust into gaps once an opponent was knocked down or off balance. The variety of options gave fighters tactical flexibility against even the best armored enemies. If you couldn't cut, you crushed. If you couldn't crush, you stabbed. And if all else failed, you hooked your enemy's leg and yanked him into the mud. It's also important to note that not all battlefield encounters were between knights in shining armor. Many soldiers wore partial protection. Maybe just a helmet and a padded jack or some chainmail covering the torso. Against those kinds of setups, axes were devastating. A sword might strike and get caught in the padding, or fail to break through the rings of chainmail. But an axe? It would bite deep, ripping through cloth, leather, and flesh in a single blow. Even the one-handed battle axe, which was lighter and faster, could tear a man open, or crush bone with a properly placed hit. And once your enemy was on the ground, whether by impact or being hooked off his feet, armor did little to protect him. Medieval combat wasn't about standing back and admiring your work. It was about finishing it. A grounded knight, disoriented and off balance, was an open target. The downward force of an axe swing, especially from a standing opponent to someone on his knees or back, was often the killing blow. No helmet design could fully protect from the sheer trauma of steel, colliding with skull at full momentum. The axe gave you the power not just to attack, but to dominate, to control the fight, and to end it on your terms. Number 3, simpler to use, easier to train. In the harsh reality of medieval life, warfare wasn't reserved for the trained elite. When trouble came knocking, whether it was in the form of a local feud, a border raid, or a full-scale invasion, men from every walk of life were expected to defend their homes, their families, and their land. But not everyone had the time, money, or opportunity to learn the intricacies of swordsmanship. Becoming proficient with a sword, especially something like a long sword or a later period rapier, required formal training, patience, and practice. Swords weren't just weapons, they were part of a martial discipline. That meant drills, footwork, understanding angles of attack, mastering defense and counterstrikes, and learning to control distance in a fight. Essentially, it was a full-time commitment, one that often required access to combat schools, tutors, or noble sponsorship. Axes, on the other hand, were brutally honest weapons. They didn't ask for elegance, and they didn't care much for formality. If you had decent upper body strength, a steady grip, and the basic sense to recognize an opening, you could use an axe to deadly effect. Its simplicity was what made it so dangerous. You didn't have to memorize complex sequences or adapt to different stances. You didn't need to dance around your opponent or anticipate his feints. With an axe, the motion was straightforward. Raise it, swing it with force, and aim for where it hurts. And that made it the perfect choice for militia units, peasant levies, or even townsfolk pressed into defending their settlements during a siege. For many of those people, the axe was already a familiar object. It was the same tool they used every day to chop wood, build homes, or clear land. The motion of lifting it overhead and driving it down into something solid wasn't foreign. It was part of their daily rhythm. That kind of practical familiarity built instinct. When you're swinging for your life instead of firewood, the transition from tool to weapon doesn't require a philosophy. It just requires adrenaline and direction. And when survival becomes the only objective, that instinct matters more than technique. This ease of use also made axes incredibly appealing for feudal lords and military commanders who needed to arm large numbers of men quickly. Forging swords took time, money, and a lot of high-quality steel. Training sword fighters took even longer, but axes could be produced at a fraction of the cost, often reworked from tools people already owned, and handed out to new recruits with minimal instruction. That meant a feudal army could swell its numbers fast. A local lord might not have a standing force, but if trouble was coming, he could call up his tenants, outfit them with axes, and have a fighting force assembled in days rather than weeks or months. And don't make the mistake of thinking these were throwaway troops. While they may have lacked polish, a group of determined men swinging axes with raw aggression was a terrifying sight on the battlefield. In close quarters combat, the sheer ferocity of axe blows could overwhelm more disciplined fighters. Especially when combined with numbers and desperation, even a half-trained militia could break enemy lines simply by refusing to stop swinging. Rage, fear, and instinct often achieved more than textbook-perfect swordsmanship ever could. Axes didn't make you a knight, but in many ways they made you something scarier, a survivor with nothing to lose. Number 4. Designed for damage and versatility. And when we talk about the medieval axe, we're not just talking about a single type of weapon with one blunt purpose. We're looking at an entire family of tools for war, carefully developed, regionally adapted, and tactically refined across centuries. Each variation of the axe had a specific role to play, and what makes them stand out isn't just their raw killing power, but the way they were designed to handle a variety of battlefield challenges with ruthless efficiency. Take, for example, the legendary bearded axe, easily one of the most recognizable and practical designs to come out of Northern Europe. Its name comes from the extended lower section of the blade that resembled a beard hanging below the chin. This wasn't just decorative flair. That hooked section could reach around the edge of a shield, catch an opponent's ankle or wrist, or snag a weapon mid-swing. In close quarters combat, especially inside tight shield formations, that ability to manipulate and control was deadly. You weren't just hitting, you were controlling space, disrupting defense, and creating your own openings. Then there was the Dane axe, a truly massive two-handed weapon with a long wooden haft and a broad, heavy blade designed for sweeping, powerful attacks. This was the kind of weapon that demanded open space and full-body commitment. In the hands of a tall, strong fighter, it could cut through shield walls, down horses, or split helmets clean open. You didn't just see it, you felt it coming. And that kind of psychological pressure changed the rhythm of a fight. Opponents had to constantly reposition to avoid those devastating arcs, opening them up to attacks from other directions. But not all axes were about size and strength. The Francisca, famously used by the Franks, was compact, curved, and perfectly balanced to be thrown. Its purpose wasn't to replace melee combat, but to soften up formations before they closed the gap. A volley of Franciscas crashing into a shield wall could cause disruption, confusion, and even break the cohesion of tightly packed enemy lines. And the best part? These axes were meant to be used both as projectiles and melee weapons, so warriors didn't lose effectiveness once the throwing phase was over. For more elite fighters, particularly those operating in armor against equally armored opponents, the poleaxe was the preferred choice. This wasn't just an axe, it was a multifunctional battle device. One side featured a chopping blade for powerful strikes. The opposite often had a hammer or flanged mace head for crushing armor. And at the top, a steel spike gave it deadly thrusting capability. In a single swing, the poleaxe could slash, hook, punch through plate, or skewer an opponent trying to retreat. It was custom built for the brutal chess match that was armored melee combat. Even beyond direct combat, the axe served critical battlefield roles. During sieges, axes were used to break down barricades, chop through wooden palisades, and hack open doors or shutters. They helped clear brush, cut wood for defenses or siege platforms, and even tore apart enemy fortifications during raids. Some axe heads had pointed tips or secondary spikes, giving them extra utility in these environments. The same weapon that opened a man's chest could just as easily open a locked gate. Perhaps most underrated, though, was the fact that every single part of the axe could be used in a fight. The blade could cut, sure, but the reverse might be a hammer or a spike for breaking bone or puncturing steel. The haft could be used to trip an opponent, jab into their throat, or bash them in the face if things got up close and ugly. In desperate moments, the handle itself could be a weapon, especially when fighting in tight quarters like a tower staircase, a narrow hallway, or shoulder to shoulder in a formation. All of this made the axe one of the most multi-dimensional weapons of the medieval world. It wasn't just about swinging hard, it was about adapting to situations on the fly. Whether on open fields, inside fortress walls, or during frantic sieges, the axe gave fighters a reliable way to stay dangerous in almost any scenario. That combination of raw power and tactical flexibility is what truly set it apart from more specialized weapons. When you carried an axe into battle, you weren't just wielding a blade. You were carrying a tool built to crush, cut, hook, split, and destroy, no matter what stood in your way. Number 5, fear and symbolism were weapons too. Long before the first axe blade met armor in the crush of a battlefield, it had already done its work in the minds of those who saw it coming. There's a raw, almost animal instinct in the way people react to axes. Unlike the sword, which often carried associations of nobility, honor, and chivalry, the axe never pretended to be anything but what it was: a tool of total destruction. It didn't pierce gracefully or dance through gaps. It split, crushed, and disfigured, and that visual brutality became a weapon all on its own. Watching a line of axe-wielding warriors advance wasn't like facing a shield wall of sword fighters. It was messier, wilder, and far more intimidating. The motion of swinging an axe was different. It involved the whole body, a violent arc that didn't just imply aggression, it demanded it. There was nothing elegant or symmetrical about it. The blade often whistled through the air before smashing into bone, and the spray that followed wasn't always clean. When you saw that kind of power, your imagination did the rest. Even before contact was made, men on the other side could already see how it might end. A shattered shield, a broken arm, a ruined face. The fear didn't creep in, it slammed into you. This was especially true when facing warriors who had made the axe a symbol of their identity. Among the Norse, for example, the axe wasn't just a battlefield weapon. It was part of who they were. It was the thing boys trained with from childhood, the tool men used to build homes, and the object warriors brought into the afterlife. The Vikings didn't carry axes because they couldn't afford swords. They carried them because they were extensions of their intent, raw and relentless. When Saxon soldiers saw a band of Norse raiders charging with raised axes, they weren't just seeing a weapon, they were witnessing a reputation made real. These weren't clean, calculated fighters. These were the men you heard about in fireside stories. Men who wanted to get close, who welcomed the chaos, who didn't fear blood. They bathed in it. That connection between the axe and violence wasn't just cultural, it was institutional. In the great courts of medieval power, where kings ruled and justice was delivered from on high, the axe had a reserved seat. The executioner's blade was never a sword. It was almost always an axe. Its shape, its force, its finality, it was chosen specifically for its brutal symbolism. There was no ambiguity about what it meant when a hooded man raised an axe in front of a crowd. Swords were for ceremony. Axes were for judgment. The axe wasn't about control, it was about ending things. This same fearsome symbolism was carried into elite military circles. The Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguards of Byzantine emperors, were notorious for their enormous two-handed axes. These men weren't ceremonial guards dressed to impress diplomats. They were war-hardened killers of Norse and Anglo-Saxon descent. Their axes weren't for show. They served one purpose: to send a message. No one harmed the emperor, not without facing steel and splintered bone. Their presence alone was often enough to deter violence. They were walking symbols of consequences. Even heraldry, the medieval system of visual identity and legacy, recognized the axe's meaning. Where lions and swords might represent courage or virtue, axes were something different. They stood for justice, retribution, and the power to enforce order by any means necessary. The imagery of a lone axe above a shield spoke to one undeniable truth. Some wrongs are corrected only through decisive, irreversible force.